Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining me for this talk, whatever time of day you happen to be joining us at. My name is Lennie, I'm a PhD student at Durham University, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about a model myself and Thomas Eerola have been putting together. So a quick overview to this presentation. I'm first going to introduce three skeptical theories. Skeptical theories being from the Greek origins, but in its contemporary academic context, meaning the sense of doubt or suspension of judgment. After reviewing these theories, I'm going to put together their points of agreement and disagreement. I'm then going to introduce two popular theories of music and emotion, one representing a discrete model, the other a dimensional model. And again, highlight some of the gaps that still exist in our music and emotion models before finally suggesting some alternatives in a skeptical constructionist appraisal model. So why have skeptical theories come about? They came about as a critique to basic emotions such as Ekman or Smith and Lazarus, and skeptical theories put together their critique around the idea that the discrete emotion paradigm had not provided the necessary or sufficient conditions to form a scientific set, a meaningful scientific set. And these critiques came from large-scale meta-analysis, both psychophysiological and autonomic, as well as methodological critiques such as Nelson and Russell's facial expressions and the forced choice paradigm. So skeptical theories instead came to the idea that there is probably an infinite number of possible emotions or shades of emotions, and that this is more meaningfully organized into a multi-dimensional space. And they go further to say that it's not the same to move the dependent variable to granulated or fuzzy set family versions of the same thing. There is still no deep ground or no dedicated mechanism that allows for the formation of a scientific set to happen. Okay, so next I introduce our three skeptical theories. First of all, we have Russell's psychological constructionist theory. Russell constructs this around three levels of effect. So first of all, we have core effect, and this is seen as an ongoing neurophysiological process divided into the two dimensions of arousal and valence. Core effect as an ongoing process guides further processing through like-valenced material and through the principle of mood congruency. On the next level, we have effective quality. Russell doesn't put forward any explicit mechanisms himself, but he does note that these again must be part of general cognition. They must be part of general cognitive processes, and it must be independent and separable from core effect. And he often equates these to concepts like stimulus evaluations. And on the final level, we have an emotional meta-experience, this referring to conscious experience. And the reason it is meta is it's the combination of many different top-down and bottom-up processes, for example, appraisals, beliefs, plans. And very importantly, this consciousness system is seen as a linking between basic motivational systems and goal-relevant systems. Our next skeptical theory is a dimensional appraisal theory. This one was put forward by Schirra, though there are many dimensional appraisal theories. Typically, appraisals are seen as subconscious cognitive mechanisms that are influencing other components through associative motivational mechanisms. They are distinct from discrete appraisal theories in that there is no meta-appraisal pattern. By that, there is no combination of appraisals that lead to the specification of a single emotion. There's been a lot of evidence recently that's for the subconscious processing of many of these appraisal patterns. They are famed for being ongoing cognitive mechanisms and have been well used in non-emotional and behavioral research. And there's also ongoing research for their underlying neurological structure. For instance, goal relevance and its location in the amygdala. And finally, most importantly, in the dimensional appraisal model is the ideas of immediate efference and recurrence. So this is that appraisals can feed forward into other components of emotion independently of each other. Again, this is back to the idea of why we have no meta-appraisal pattern. And this brings a lot more flexibility to the emotion system. The last skeptical theory I'd like to put forward to you is one developed by Agnes Moores in her parallel competitive dual process model. It's often used to explain behavior and again works around the idea that we're using the same general cognitive components and subcomponents to explain emotional and non-emotional behavior. It differs, however, from the classic interventionist dual process model, which highlights the role of the stimulus-driven component and assumes that the goal-directed component can intervene on the stimulus-driven component when there is enough time for this decision-making. And Agnes Moores goes out to critique this. She instead challenges that automatic non-automatic distinction and provides evidence for the fact that goals not only can range from very simple to complex goals, but they can also compensate for suboptimal operating conditions and rely on associative and rule-based processing. And through this, she reorganizes the dual process model to put a precedence on the goal-directed mechanism over the stimulus-driven one. Why? Because it more often leads to the most optimal behavior, which is best for the organism. So to round off, there are some key points that are seen across all the skeptical theories. They all agree that we should move away from folk terms or granular interpretations of discrete emotions and move instead to describing these components through multidimensional space. They do disagree, however, of how causally related these components are and whether these components will form a meaningful scientific set of their own. The one key linking principle between all these theories, though, is the importance that they place on goals. Goals become hold a key place in each of these theories. So, moving on to introduce two contemporary theories of musical emotions. First of all, we have the Brecht-Remmer, put forward by Jocelyn. This hypothesizes several mechanisms. These mechanisms typically go on to predict discrete emotion terms. For example, the brainstem reflex might go on and trigger the discrete emotion of surprise. Many of these mechanisms have been very well studied from this point and produced a substantial amount of research, for example, rhythmic entrainment. Jocelyn predicts that there is no appraisal mechanisms in his earlier theories, but in his more recent interpretations, these appraisal mechanisms, he argues, are present, but only at very low levels of processing. For example, where the goal is explicitly driven by the organism's need to survive. And through experienced sampling studies, he's argued that this really doesn't make up a significant proportion of the actual experiences we get from listening to music. For example, loud music while trying to study makes up a very small proportion of our experience with strong emotions in music. Most recently as well, he has added the aesthetic judgments mechanism, this being subjective evaluations of the stimulus. And in his more recent interpretations, he's argued that this forms the mix of the paradoxical musical emotions, such as sad music producing happy feelings, and it's this interaction between aesthetic emotions and everyday emotions that is causing this. Of course, there are several critiques we can offer of Jocelyn's theory. First of all, I find that musical goals are incredibly unacknowledged within Jocelyn's theory. A recent review by Liam Maloney finds several goals that can be associated with music, and moreover, aesthetic goals can be learnt and socially constructed as well as relevant to the biological origins. Since the introduction of the aesthetics judgment mechanism, which we go through as influencing other mechanisms to produce these mixed emotions, is also quite problematic. First of all, in music, it would appear logical that the aesthetic judgment mechanism would be the default mechanism, most musical emotional experiences being aesthetic. But the theory offers no logical prediction for why it would take such a privileged position in the emotion theory. Moreover, it seems to suggest that the other mechanisms predicted actually become the mediating mechanisms, while the aesthetic judgment mechanism takes priority most of the time. But even in this case, we have no suggestion of when, how, by what degree, or in what circumstances different mechanisms might take priority over others, and many of them correlating with appraisal style, skill, novelty, style. So in a second musical model, we have Julian Cespedes Guevara's constructivist model. This one puts forward a more skeptical idea that music is not communicating basic emotions, it is communicating affect instead. We have the core affect model in there. And this is further split between different mechanisms that are relevant to the acoustic characteristics of the music, the stimulus, and incorporates mechanisms that are relevant to the personal significance and the learning process. The incorporation of appraisals is also very relevant there. We have the idea of control and goal relevance being placed into the model, a very skeptical approach to this. And these appraisal mechanisms are further noted to be of importance in the personal relevance. But again, we have some problems with the way that the appraisals can be constructed here. The appraisals again seem to represent more utilitarian ideas. These appraisal mechanisms are also not very well defined. There is no discussion about how they interact between the conceptual act and core effect, that is, how these models interact with the stimulus, or how they interact with other mechanisms within the conceptual act, again, by what degree or in what situations this is the case. The incorporation of the aesthetic judgment mechanism again suffers from many of the problems that Jocelyn does. It doesn't put it in a privileged position in this model, but it does incorporate several expanding ideas of aesthetic criteria to be evaluated by. The bottom-up, top-down distinction within this model is also quite reminiscent of the classical dual process model. I think there's a conversation to be had with skeptical theories where the incorporation of a parallel competitive dual process model could be incredibly beneficial. And lastly, which is not really a critique of the model in itself, but what research has been done with it, the continued testing of such models has led to the idea that we're still trying to group these mechanisms around emotion families or emotionally granular terms. So to put it all together, a few skeptical comments on the literature so far. Appraisals have begun to be acknowledged, but there is more that can be done. They're an incredibly invaluable component of nearly all emotion theories, and music is no exception in this. Musical goals also has a key point in the literature and should be recentered to focus how our motivational and goal-driven systems are interacting with the stimuli around us. Valence seems to be a key mechanism of interest, but it's not so well understood in its relationship to the stimulus. It's perceived to be a more cognitively constructed one that's tied to personal relevance and ongoing meaning construction. And there's a lot of work we can take from skeptical models that could be highly informative to how we construct valence. And finally, the focus on folk terms. Skeptical theories would again suggest that we should be moving to new dependent variables, so that the components of emotion can be studied that may go on to form a meaningful scientific set of their own. So finally, given the skeptical critique of the current emotion models, we're putting forward this constructionist appraisal model, one that hopes to recenter these models around the idea of goals in music. So here we have the origins of the model and placing appraisal very much in the center. This is the five-sided shape in the middle that is going to be representing appraisal here. And we have something very similar to Russell's 3 levels of effect. We do acknowledge that these processes between core effect and other cognitive components might happen without appraisal, but we argue that this is less likely to be the case in music. Furthermore, as appraisal is so important in the continuation of meaning generation and valence, the assessment of the stimulus and the situation leads to different weightings between these cognitive components. And finally, we get the conception of these metavalences. Through appraisals, we get this conception that each appraisal represents a microvalence that becomes a metavalence at higher levels of cognitive processing. And finally, within our appraisal space, what we're trying to get at is the idea of a multi-dimensional space, one which is grouped around several components interacting constantly. We do highlight here the goal relevance threshold, this being a particularly important dimension in a lot of the literature, and we argue that might be a mechanism that marks the distinction between cognitively cold and cognitively hot processes, i.e. appraisals are ongoing cognitive mechanisms, but as we cross a goal relevance threshold, we move from non-emotional to emotional processing. So just to sum up with a few novel components that our model is trying to offer. So in terms of the appraisals, we want to recenter the appraisals into the emotion process. We offer the idea of partly redundant appraisals, therefore the idea that each appraisal can feed forward and be reappraised independently of other appraisals, shaping the emotion experience. We add in the context of the goal relevance threshold. We acknowledge that goals can be both learnt and socially constructed. We also hypothesize that these component interactions are going to be dynamic and bidirectional. Specifically, we offer some hypotheses for the link between some of these interactions, specifically between appraisals and core effect and appraisals and action tendencies. As noted in the model, these interactions are likely to be weighted and changed by individual and situation. And finally, we offer that the new dependent variable should be moving away from folk terms. If I could offer one takeaway from our model, I'd really like it to be that it seeks to direct research to identifying what makes music relevant and meaningful. Thank you very much for listening, and any questions?